Hi, I'm Sean Munger. I'm That History Guy, and from time to time, I'm going to take a little time out from my usual geohistory videos and do some asides on history and historical thinking in general. This one is on the subject of fake history. You've heard of fake news. Well, fake history is fake news's older brother, and it's even more damaging and often harder to stamp out. I run a history blog, thathistoryguy.com, and much more long before that, seanmunger.com, where I do a lot of historical articles. And whenever you do history online, occasionally you're going to get comments or pushback from people who have some pretty odd ideas about things that happened in the past. Case in point, in October of 2015, I posted an article called The Malleable Past: How Easy Is It to Fake History? Someone posted in response to this article a comment insisting that the Nanking Massacre, that was the horrifying mass slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians by invading Japanese forces in December 1937, somebody posted a comment questioning whether or not that event actually happened. In that article, I had used the Nanking Massacre as an example of a historical event that, despite the misguided beliefs of some people, was not and could not be faked. This commenter, of course, completely missed the point of the article, which was to explain what history is, how it's studied, and how the intellectually sound methods, what they are, that we use to understand what happened in the past. None of that, of course, mattered to this person whose sole blinkered goal was to assert against the entire weight of the historical record that there was something fishy about the Nanking Massacre. Well, of course, I was annoyed by that. The Nanking Massacre is really only one example. There are numerous others, like, for example, the belief that the idea that Adolf Hitler was some kind of leftist, which is, of course, not true. In fact, Hitler and the Nazis are a magnet for fake history beliefs, such as the false impression promoted by gonzo documentaries on the History Channel and such, that the Nazis were heavily into black magic or the occult. It's just not true. Just a false narrative of history. Usually when there's some kind of moral judgment lurking behind a historical event, like responsibility for the Nanking Massacre or Ottoman Turkey's massacre of the genocide against the Armenians in 1915, fake history narratives will often crop up in those situations and try to shift or eliminate the moral culpability. Or in addition to, the examples I've been giving you are denialism, basically, but there's more than just denialism. There's also distortion of legitimate historical fact. This often happens around the Crusades, for example. Of course, the Crusades were a series of wars by countries in Western Europe against the Islamic world in the Middle Ages. Often the history of those conflicts will be distorted as an excuse for Islamophobia. When armchair historians take on the Crusades, often the argument will devolve into who started it, or who was worse, or this massacre was more brutal than that massacre, that type of thing. The problem really with fake history is that it often leads to really terrible counter reactions. Long before Twitter and Breitbart and Reddit and those kinds of things, indeed in the era of newspapers and hand-distributed leaflets, the Nazi Party in Weimar Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s told a false story about how and why Imperial Germany had lost the First World War in November of 1918. In the Nazis' version, the false version, treacherous liberal politicians and cowardly generals made a panicky and premature move for an armistice, thus robbing Germany of the chance to win the war and sentencing the country to the tyranny of the Treaty of Versailles. This fake history has been called the stab in the back. In reality, what happened was that German military leaders crunched the numbers, they realized the war was unwinnable, and they decided to pull the plug before more senseless killing continued and their country was completely destroyed. The impact of the stab in the back myth, that fake historical narrative of what happened, was huge. After the Nazis came to power in 1933, that myth was used to justify further German aggressions that led to World War II and the attempted extermination of the Jews, who in the Nazis' version were part of the stab in the back theory. Jewish Bolsheviks, they were called. So obviously this was false, and you can see that's an example of the pernicious effect of fake history. Not all believers in fake history are bad people, however. Indeed, the really awful thing about fake history is how easily it gets internalized and accepted as fact by ordinary people. Case in point, on November 22nd, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone and not as part of a conspiracy, assassinated President John F. Kennedy. Now, when I make a statement like that, probably 3/4 of the people who are hearing that statement are going to say, no, that's not true. Actually, it is true. It is provable historical fact. In fact, the historian and lawyer Vincent Bugliosi wrote a very comprehensive book on this subject. In fact, it's one of the books behind me on my shelf there, the best book ever written on the Kennedy assassination. Yet, because of the cottage industry in assassination literature and conspiracy theories and that sort of stuff, something like 3/4 of the American public firmly believe that there was, in fact, a conspiracy in the murder of JFK. And the people who believe that often think that the question has been settled, that it's not really an open question. So once fake history takes hold, it's extremely hard to shake. The problem of fake history and fake information in general can blind someone to how to process real information in the real world. A passionate believer in an item of fake history, like, for example, some alternative explanation of the Nanking Massacre, if you give that person proof that, in fact, it happened the way that it happened, they might come back and say something like, well, but how can we really know what happened in the past? How do we know that a fact is true? I tear my hair out when I hear stuff like this. Usually when someone says this kind of thing, they're doing it as a bluff. There's no genuine commitment behind it to understand how perception and the methods of history really work. So think about it. If you ask, well, how do we know a fact is true, just as a tactic to try to defend a false narrative, that suggests that there can be no answer to the question, how do we know a fact is true? At least no answer that the person asking the question is willing to accept. So when somebody says, how do we know a historical fact is true, without really trying to understand the methods of history, what it's intended to do is to act as sort of a permission slip for someone to pick and choose which facts they're going to decide to believe, not based on whether the fact is independently verifiable, but on some other criteria, usually what ideological belief it serves. Again, not everyone who does this is being deliberately deceptive. I'm not saying that. People who do this sort of thing often believe that they are, in fact, skeptics, or that they're employing critical thinking, when in fact they're doing the exact opposite. This is why understanding history and how historical knowledge works is so important. History is not just a game of telephone. Historians don't just read something in a book and then assume it's automatically true. They have to show their work, so to speak, and prove the sources that they're relying on. Historians, real historians, work on the basis of primary sources, which means evidence that comes from the time we're talking about. They can be documents or pictures, archaeological evidence, really lots of things. History books have, at least good history books, have pages and pages of footnotes, endnotes. These are all citations to primary sources. If you want to, you can go back and look up these sources on your own. And in fact, many people do. I do that all the time. Primary sources, understanding what they are and understanding what they have to say is key to the process of history. In my geohistory series here on YouTube, I take you into the actual places where things happened. In the Presidential Places series, Thomas Jefferson's Library, for example. Or last week in the World War II series, I showed the remnants of the Mulberry Harbors. Those were the artificial harbors that the Allies built on the beaches at Normandy to shuttle supplies into France during D-Day in World War II. These are primary sources. The existence of these things are primary sources. You can't fake this stuff. Now, of course, it's true that not all historical facts are equally clear or ascertainable. There are things in history we don't know. That's absolutely true. But that doesn't mean that no facts are ascertainable, and that everything that's said to have happened in the past is equally untrustworthy or questionable. So beware of fake history. Check the sources. Think critically. Use your common sense. The same tools that people use to distinguish real news from fake news are equally valuable in distinguishing real history from fake history. Historians serve a very important function in our society. I think their work is critical. History isn't just trivia, and it's not just an entertainment product that can be consumed. It's an important way of looking at the world and of thinking about it. So, thanks very much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.